Achtung, Achtung, welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk with me, Al Murray and James Holland. And we're very fortunate to be joined by a very special guest from the other side of the Atlantic. James, who are we talking to today?
Well, we're talking to someone who's become a firm friend of the podcast, Marc Milner, who listeners will remember from giving such a fantastic discussion about the Atlantic War, as we're now calling it, a few months ago.
Well done.
Marc hasn't only just written about the Battle of the Atlantic. He's moved on to dry land and did a fantastic book called Stopping the Panzers: The Untold Story of D-Day, which really charts primarily the Canadians running up against full throttle of the 12th SS Hitler Jugend Division, who are arriving into the D-Day bridgehead. Well, the first troops very much on the night of D-Day itself, and then they have this sort of massive series of engagements, very traumatic engagements, on the 7th of June, and without wanting to kind of steal all Marc's sandwiches, they do incredibly well. And I've got to say, this book completely, it was just, I mean, Battle of the Atlantic was valuable to me when I was doing War in the West. Stopping the Panzers was invaluable to me when I was doing my Normandy book. And I just, I've been saying it for years, the Canadians are just so undersold in the Second World War, when it comes to kind of the effort and the influence they have, both on the sea, on land, and in the air. It's absolutely incredible. But this is an amazing story, which just is traditionally not been part of the narrative. So, Marc, it's great to have you here to kind of, sell it for the Canadians on D-Day and immediately afterwards, and the kind of incredible effort they do at stopping the kind of SS juggernaut.
Well, thanks for the opportunity. Any chance to talk about the Canadians and Normandy. Look forward to it.
James, what are you writing about next? Has Marc covered that too? That's my immediate thought.
Well, actually, Marc's on it the other way around in this particular occasion, although I don't think he's paid much attention to what I've been writing about because he's doing all his own research. But you're doing, we were talking about it, weren't we, just before Christmas, Marc? You're in the middle, or you finished a big work on the wider Normandy campaign.
Well, I'd like to say I'm finished. I started out, 5 years ago this winter to write a short essay to get me to 1939, and I'm now up to 21 chapters and about 1,500 pages, and I've fought my way to the end of June. I set out to write one chapter on...
This is, what's it sounding like? This is sounding like Peter Caddick.
Well, here's the deal, and you probably understand this. My old supervisor used to say, we write to know.
Yeah.
So, I often told my graduate students, you can write the first paragraph, but how do you start the second one? And what do you put in it? And where do you go from there? So the problem I've had with this whole story is every time I bump into something, I realize I don't know anything about it. And then I realize that what I've read is only a partial story. And then I start digging. And before you know it, instead of writing a short chapter, I've got 65 pages and a completely different way of looking at what's transpired. So I seem to have found myself rewriting the Second World War, unfortunately.
But have you got, what are your kind of, I'm not trying to kind of reduce it to nothing, but what are your sort of, your big takes that you feel haven't really been brought to the forefront in the past, that you've suddenly thought, hang on a minute, why are we not looking at it in this way? What are the big things?
Well, one of the big takeaways I've gotten from this, and I was kind of poking around, is the extent to which Operation Overlord is an overwhelmingly British operation. When you start looking at what individuals are doing, and history tends to be written as national narratives, you forget that much of the shaping operations of Overlord were done by the British, either in the air or especially at sea. It's yes. difficult for Eisenhower to actually get ships out of Ernie King to support the operation. So that tends to be forgotten. They tend to forget that 80% of the assault forces and virtually all of the initial maritime support in terms of logistic support, small ships getting stuff to the beach, is organized by the British. The Americans, I'm sad to say, are really not very generous when it comes to writing about what other people are doing to help them. You can go to Pointe du Hoc any number of times, and I defy you to find out how many British sailors were killed, wounded, or missing putting the Rangers ashore at Pointe du Hoc from the Ben My Cree. That was a British assault landing. The Rangers who landed on Omaha Beach were landed by the Brits. The Omaha Beach was swept by the 34th Canadian Minesweeper Flotilla. They were within a mile and a half of the beach at 4 o'clock in the morning. So the first people to Omaha Beach were actually a bunch of Canadian minesweepers. So there's a huge amount going on. And until the end of June, there are more Anglo-Canadian forces in Normandy than there are American.
Yes.
So Overlord, and what I'm tracking is the way in which the American media and the British media tried to sort all this stuff out and create, if you like, a narrative. If journalism is the first draft of history, then the Brits get written out of the Normandy campaign right from the get-go.
I mean, the whole thing, after all, the Americans have a Mulberry, don't they? Which is a British idea. It's a British approach, isn't it? So even in that aspect, the British are dominant of how we're going to do this, how we're going to run this thing. I mean, it's an excellent point you're making, Mark.
Well, listen,
obviously,
the American media goes into fits of apoplexy trying to explain to the Americans how Montgomery is not actually in command. Right? American news magazines do a fairly decent job of trying to explain this. But I've been going through the papers of Ernest Dupuis, who's the director of public relations for SHAEF. He's an American. He's a colonel, done a lot of work for the U.S. Army. And he says as early as April, he says, we can't sell this to Americans. They just don't understand that the American landings in Normandy could be under British command. And there's a really nice comment from the British Information Service on, I think it's the 22nd of June, reporting on the state of newsreels being shown in American theaters. And their comment is, the newsreels are still gagging over the fact that Montgomery's in command of the land operations and Ramsey's in command of operations at sea, because they tend to equate Admiral Kirk, who's the Western Task Force commander, which has a huge British presence in it, by the way, as being the equivalent of Admiral Ramsey, who's actually the overall Neptune commander.
Yeah.
So they're just, they're having real problems because the Americans are convinced that it's an American operation and they can't figure out why the Brits and the Canadians are there.
I mean, the interesting thing is that there's incredibly good reasons for this. I mean, the US Navy has got its hands full in a very full way in the Pacific and is doing a incredible job out there. And, Britain is the kind of host nation for the launch pad. All the infrastructure's there and, there's incredibly good reasons for it. So
I wouldn't argue that, James.
No one's dissing the Americans. No one is belittling the effort of the Americans, which is considerable in the Second World War and is considerable in the Normandy operation as well. It's just what you're saying, and obviously, I completely agree, and it's what I was saying in my Normandy book, is that actually it's just history. The narrative of the Normandy campaign has just been completely distorted, so much so that you can now bring American tourists can go over to Normandy and kind of stand on Pointe du Hoc, not have the faintest idea there are even British or Canadians involved at all. But
to take this point forward, I think from the British perspective, the Canadians are absent also. So
yes.
In a British popular telling of or the imaginary picture.
Well, they certainly don't get the credit they deserve.
So that's the same thing, I think. And so here we are. That's exactly what we're here to talk about, and
yes,
to literally put it on the map. And Mark, I imagine you're familiar with the Project 44 thing. I mean, I've got that in front of me, so that when you take us through the story of this battle, I can literally picture what's going on. Because the Canadian contribution is essentially at the pointy end is a third of what the British or Duke forces are bringing to Normandy, isn't it? Essentially.
Eventually, yeah. I mean, we're going to talk about that. The original plan was to have 1st Canadian Army, all 5 divisions ashore by the end of D+14. Right. So that the Cossack plan gets changed. But listen, the British neglect of the Canadians, if you want to call it that, is actually calculated. It's part of the plan. because the British realize, and this is, you're right, James, there's a huge context here. 1944 is not only an election year. This is one of the things I'm exploring in this book. It's also the year when there's a meeting at Bretton Woods about whether the future is going to be the U.S. dollar or the British pound, whether the economic heart of the world is going to be New York or London. And the Brits are into it up to their eyeballs, trying to actually salvage, if that's the right word, might be a little too strong, but salvage their position in the post-war world that's going to be dominated by American money, American economy, and American military power. And they can't afford to have the Canadians shaken out of the British Empire effort. So there's actually a concerted effort in the period before D-Day to subsume the Canadians under British. And the Canadian government pushes back and the Canadians push back. And there's quite a little tale to be told there about, do we even say that they're Canadians? The Brits want to say Anglo-American and Allied. And the Canadians go, whoa, wait a minute. We've got a huge presence at sea. And you may not know this, but 83 Group, RAF, is actually an RCAF group. It was established in the fall of 1943 to be the Canadian group which would support 1st Canadian Army, which would be part of the assault on Normandy. And we can talk more about that, but when 1st Canadian Army gets the boot at the end of December, they ask 83 Group, what do you guys want to do? Do you want to stay in the leading edge, be the first group ashore? Or do you want to stick with 1st Canadian Army and come in sometime later? And the Air Force says, hell with you, we're going straight in. 83 Group, it never gets fully developed after that because the decision to switch it to 2nd British Army gets the Canadians to back off. But the Canadian plan at the end of 43, and it's only partially achieved, is to have all the headquarters, all the support, all the hospital, all the maintenance, everything, and most of the squadrons, RCAF, all paid for by the Canadian government. So half of 83 Group is actually RCAF, and a large portion of its maintenance and support are RCAF. It's not what it would have been had it been left with the Canadian Army. So it's about 50-60% Canadian. So the Canadian group supports 2nd British Army, and then a kind of polyglot group, 84 Group, which has a lot of European squadrons, European Air Force and Exile squadrons, ends up supporting the 1st Canadian Army when it finally gets operational in July. So there's a huge Canadian air component, and when the Longest Day aired in Toronto in the 1960s, did a kind of premiere airing. It actually got booed by Canadian veterans because what they showed for Spitfires were 2 French Spitfires, where the largest support on that day, if it wasn't British, was probably Canadian. Anyway, so there is a plan to actually write the Canadians out because the Canadians need to be part of the empire, and we refuse to get in the boat. And we just say, no, you guys, do what you want, but we're Canadians. And in the end, they do. They win out, and they win out because they get support from the Americans who say, "You guys, you have to recognize what the Canadians are doing. It's pretty important." Anyway, I've tracked all that in one of these enormous, outlandishly long chapters, which I've completed. Sorry,
but the Americans aren't doing that to boost the Canadians. They're doing that to undermine the British, aren't they? I mean, that's how American power works, doesn't it?
Well, the Americans know that the Canadians, and we should talk about that. The Canadians have been central to the Overlord planning from 1942 onwards. Yeah, and when the film, the documentary that's released at the time of the D-Day landings.
I can't remember what it's called either.
Is it Spearhead?
I know what you mean.
Yeah.
Something like that.
The Americans actually complain and tell them, you got to take this back. You got to put some Canadians in it. You got to put some Canadian footage. You got to put some recognition of Canadians in it because it's just so biasly pro-British. And it comes too late. It comes too late. They don't have time to fix it. So what you see when you Google it and watch it on YouTube is not what the Americans and even the public relations people at SHAEF wanted. But it's what we got.
Right.
So we should talk about stopping the Panzers, or we'll be done.
Yes. So the point about stopping the Panzers is that the Canadians push forward towards Caen on D+1, and they come full whack into the 12th SS Panzer Division as it's arriving into the front. And a whole, it's not an entire division to start off with, but the Canadian 12th Hitler Jugend are bristling with firepower, they're bristling with equipment, they're bristling with men, they're motivated, they're gung-ho, and they effectively come up against kind of 2 battalions of infantry, not much artillery support till later in the day, and literally a handful of tanks. And the Canadians check them. And I mean, in a nutshell, that's it, isn't it? But it's an incredible feat of arms, a defensive action, really.
Yeah, it's actually worse than that, James.
Okay, go on then.
Because the historians have tended to focus on the Canadian battle with the 12th SS, and they forget that there's a whole ersatz battalion of 716th Division actually occupying the villages that the Canadians are going through. By one estimate, Les Buissons, Buron, Auty have about 1,000 infantry from 716th Division that have escaped from the beach defenses and have been pulled together in Kampfgruppe Rauch.
Yeah.
And so they're actually in place. You can argue about their combat ability and their sort of will to fight, but they're there. And 1,000 guys with a lot of guns. That's a major project. Yeah. And then there are. I tried to track for that book, and I'm still tracking that stuff. About. Maybe a third of 21st Panzer is in the area.
Yes, they are. Yeah,
it's in the it's in the valley of the Meuse. They are in Buron and Auty and Les Buissons. Excuse me, and they're over in the front of 3rd British Division over at Galmanche and Caen and Saint-Contesse. So there's already. I tried to do a kind of calculation, I think, for that book, and come up with the fact that Canadians were outnumbered probably 3-1, but possibly as much as 4 or 5-1 once you throw 12th SS into the mix.
Yep.
So it's and they're attacking, at least initially.
Yeah.
So I think the training is superb. We should go back and talk about what it is they were expected to do. So they take on a huge number. And I tracked this down, and it's interesting that the Canadian official history says nothing about anybody other than 12th SS. It's a great failing of Charles Stacey's book that he didn't actually go back and read the narratives prepared by his own historians in 1944, which would have given him a better idea of what was actually happening. But we did not have good intelligence at the time, and when they were writing the history in the 1950s, they did not have good access to all the German documents for reasons of, not quite clear. So they were not sure how many they were actually up against. And by any event, it was already at that point seen as a failure. And so I think there was a tendency to say, we'll just write it up as a failure and we'll let it go. But we should go back and talk about what it was the Canadians were supposed to do, right?
Yeah.
Their op order, right? So the way I've often explained this to, in terms of stopping the panzers to groups I've spoken with, is you need to think of it at kind of 2 levels. One is that the 1st Canadian Army was, by 1943, the single most combat-ready force in the British Isles. There were 5 divisions, 2 armored brigades. 2nd Canadian Corps headquarters was not really up to speed. They were still in the process of kind of coalescing. They hadn't done well in Exercise Spartan in March of 1943. But 1st Canadian Army had been the force, if you believe Andy McNaughton, that had defended Britain from invasion, and then it flipped over into a counter-invasion force. It was euphemistically described as a dagger pointed at Berlin. And that was really meant to be for Operation Roundup. If the Germans collapsed, they were going to chuck the Canadians ashore and they were going to drive. And kind of like the FOCO theory, kind of like Castro marching on Cuba, the hope was that the forces in Europe would rally around this spearhead and, off we'd go and the Germans would collapse as they had in 1918 and it would all be good. But that said, it's actually training for an amphibious assault in 1943 against a defended beach. And if you read some of Freddie Morgan's stuff and you go through their Cossack planning documents, the Canadians are actually central to all the planning for the Second Front in 1943. The original Cossack plan had 2nd British Army doing the assault, and they're just beginning to pull that together in the summer of 1943. 2nd British Army headquarters was not very well developed. And then the exploitation force was going to be 1st Canadian Army. And if Freddie Morgan had his way, by D+12, D+14, there would have been 7 American divisions ashore, 6 British, and 5 Canadian, plus the 2 Canadian armored brigades. And it would be, the plan was that the Canadians would come ashore as they'd be the exploitation force. When first U.S. Army gets involved in the planning in the fall of 1943, what Morgan does is shift the planning so that first U.S. Army does the attack, and then first British Corps goes ashore, and then first Canadian Corps goes ashore, and when those two British Commonwealth formations are ashore, the first headquarters to arrive would be 1st Canadian Army. And the army that would arrive later would be 2nd British Army. And that plan, in several permutations, survives until the end of December. And we'll talk about why that fails. But if Morgan has his way, in the fall of 43, D-Day is going to be a North American operation.
Yeah.
It's going to be the Americans and the Canadians. First U.S. Army, first Canadian Army, side by side on the beaches of Normandy. Well, what we need to talk ultimately about the armored attack, but just very quickly, what kicks the struts out from underneath that plan is Brooke doesn't like McNaughton, Andy McNaughton. They've had an ongoing feud since 1917 at Vimy, when Brooke was serving in the Canadian Corps Artillery. A lot of people in the Canadian Army don't like Andy McNaughton because they think he's kind of stodgy and a bit of a gunner and maybe too slow. And he's a guy that kind of grates on people. So anyway, even the Minister of Defense in Canada doesn't like Andy McNaughton. And the other problem for Canada, we talk about politics, is the Canadian Army needs to get in the fight because the Canadian government is on the ropes politically. And so they contrive to get 1st Division into Sicily. And then when that doesn't cut much ice home politically, they contrive to send out 5th Armored Division and the headquarters of 1st Canadian Corps. So by the time you get to October of 1943, 1st Canadian Army in the UK consists of 2nd Canadian Corps, not much else. So the plan initially is to, we'll kind of stick 1st British Corps in there, and then it'll be 1st Canadian Army. Maybe we'll call it 1st Anglo-Canadian Army. And then this goes, oh my God, but you can't have Andy McNaughton commanding it because he's a disaster, according to some. So they contrive to confront him about his illness, about his exhaustion from being at the job for too long, and the government finally convinces him that he needs to go, and they sack him in early December. So that by the end of December, 1st Canadian Army's in a bit of a shambles, and I don't think it would have survived Montgomery's arrival because when Montgomery comes back, and the initial joint plan expands the front, it's got to be an Anglo-American operation for international, diplomatic, political, economic, you name it. It can't be an American-Canadian operation. It's got to be Anglo-American. So 1st Canadian Army gets the boot. Even the Germans notice this. They say there's actually an international news broadcast on, I think it's Oceana, which is the German international radio broadcast service that talks about the sacking of Andy McNaughton and how he actually quit because he's had enough Canadians butchered by the British. He doesn't need to have them now butchered by Eisenhower and the Americans. Anyway, so the Germans are tracking this. So 1st Canadian Army, which is always seen, and this is important when we get around to stopping the Panzers, always seen through 42 and 43 as the lead horse in the opening of the second front, gets the boot. So, what the Canadians were going to do, and I found it really hard to track this. I did track it in Stopping the Panzers. Is everybody's worried about the Panzer counterattack? Where is it going to be? How big will it be? Where and when will it arrive? And the critical ground they end up talking about is either side of a little river called the Meuse, M-U-E, which doesn't feature at all in the Normandy literature, but it features in the Canadian literature and it features in the German planning. And I have to tell you a little war story about this because I backed into this subject really accidentally. I had a grad student who was doing a thesis on naval fire support, a guy named Dan Malone. Hi, Dan, if you're out there. Great thesis. And Dan, about 20 years ago, Dan produced the deployment plan for the Canadian artillery on D+1. And I looked at that and I thought, holy shit. That's an exceptional amount of artillery, and we need to talk about that. And it's actually either side of the Meuse River. And look at all those anti-tank guns. They're just anti-tank guns everywhere. What the hell are these guys doing? And then the little kind of light went on in my brain. It's like, holy shit, I know what they're doing. They're actually getting ready for a Panzer counterattack. Because at that point, I had walked the ground probably a half a dozen or 10 times. I knew it quite well. I knew the Great Plain on either side of the Mew River, and I thought, damn, I bet you that's what it is. And that's really what started stopping the panzers.
Right.
I just started, opening up documents and turning over rocks and finding two things. One is that the Cossack planning exactly identified that ground as the key ground for a major panzer counterattack. And I couldn't find any reference to it in most of the German sources. I didn't have time to do this to get to a German archive. But I began to dig into old books. If you want a new idea, get into an old book. So I started reading the memoir literature and some of the books from the 1940s. And what it began to reveal fairly quickly is that that's the ground that Rommel had identified as the key ground. And he wanted 4 panzer divisions on that ground by the end of April 1944. So both sides identify it as the key ground. So at some point, and I've never found the smoking gun on this, I've found the result, but I've never found the planning document. At some point, the Canadian division gets armed to the teeth. 3rd Canadian Division is the single most powerful Allied division to land on D-Day, bar none. It has just a staggering amount of firepower. James, you've read about it in that book. The average British Commonwealth division has 72 field artillery pieces. The Canadians get 144 for the beachhead battles.
Wow.
6 field regiments, 4 of them self-propelled, and 2 attached British 25-pounder towed regiments. Then they get the 79th Medium Regiment under command. I think it's 16 4.5-inch guns. And then you look around and you discover that they've actually also assigned to them the British First Corps Anti-Tank Regiment, 62nd Anti-Tank Regiment, which is the Corps Anti-Tank Regiment, but it's actually deployed in the Canadian zone to protect all this artillery. So the Canadians just have a staggering amount of artillery attached to them. And every company that comes ashore with the Canadians, every company gets a foo.
Yeah.
There's so much artillery that every company gets a foo. Not every battalion, every company gets a foo. There are 4 foos per battalion. So they come loaded for bear. They don't. And one of the interesting things about this, of course, is they can't get everything ashore because of the storm.
Yep.
Everybody says, oh, the Germans can't get there because there's an Allied air attack and blah, blah. Well, there's 100 miles of open sea with most of the tail of a storm raging. There's a break on Tuesday, the 6th of June. They get some ashore. But they can't get most of the anti-tank guns ashore until about D+3. Anyway, so the Canadians come loaded for bear, and if you read their op order, which I think is really kind of interesting, and you read other op orders, the Canadian operation order for 3rd Canadian Division says, your job is to establish fortress positions astride the Cambayou Highway at Puto, Nori, Bretteville, Carpiquet Airfield, and stop the counterattack.
Yeah. And the reason, let's just pause there a second, because the reason why this is the obvious ground is because to the east of Caen, you've got the ridge that runs down to the sea, which the paratroopers and so on, the airborne troops are trying to get hold of. And you've also got the Bourg-en-Bresse ridge. And there's not so much room for maneuver in that area. But round to the west of Caen, you've got this big kind of open... It's not bocage here. This is big, wide open fields. This is the area through which Epsom later passes the back end of June. But it's so obvious that this is the place through which panzers have a clear thrust to the sea.
We need to take a break right now. We'll be back after these propaganda messages from the world of capitalism. Welcome back to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. Ask Mark, is there chatter from the Germans? Have they identified that this is what Rommel wants to do from Ultra, or is this a reading of the land and understanding the topography and the maps?
To the best of my knowledge, it's just good basic military engineering. They look at the ground.
Right, okay.
Now, listen, that said, James is absolutely right. You need depth. The ground north of Caen, if you go from Caen to Langrune to go all the way up to Sword, that's much better ground. And much of it's much more open. but there's no room to echelon panzer divisions in depth. Once the British get to the Bassy and get down to Caen and you can't echelon panzer divisions in an urban area, which is what Caen is. And the airborne take the bridges, so you can't come across that way. But it's interesting that 21st Panzer was garrisoned in that very ground, west of Caen, echelon down the Orne River Valley and across the Odon in the period before D-Day. They had most of their anti-tank strength actually deployed in the zone that the Canadians would attack on D-Day and D+1. And then, to me, the telling point in all this, the kind of continuity of the ground and its importance, is that when von Kluge takes over as CNC West in early July 1944, the first thing he plans is a major panzer counterattack down either side of the Mew River Valley. It's the only place where you can use tanks everywhere. Don't get me wrong. I mean, you're going to find panzers everywhere. But if you want to mass them, if you want to stack 3 or 4 or 6, one behind the other, and make it 3 across, and you want to be able to rip around, this is the ground that you need. And the other thing is, once you get to the beach, in theory, you could just swing left, slip over that big broad crest that is in behind the Soule River, and then just pour down onto the Great Plain in front of Gold Beach, and keep heading west. I don't think most Germans, with the exception of Rommel, maybe Schweppenberg, understood what happens when you bring mass tanks within range of naval fire support. But so I don't think the German counterattack could have got really nasty. But gee, if you have Warspite and Belfast and Ryan and a whole Agincourt, whatever it is, blasting away at you,
you're not going to get too far. But the point is on D+1, they're not doing that, because there's a hiatus, isn't there, where the link, isn't there a radio, if I remember right, there's a sort of radio breakdown. They can't get the offshore naval guns to support them. So you really do have, and the artillery, the massive artillery is kind of directed, isn't it, towards Douvres, and so you have these battalions, infantry battalions, out on a limb to the kind of northwest of Caen, confronting this massive German forces, whether it be the 716, whether it be the 12 SS, or whether it be the 21st Panzer. I mean, the bit I was particularly talking about was the bit, around Buron and all the rest of it, where the 7th Infantry Brigade, Canadian 7th Infantry Brigade, comes up against comes up against 12 SS. But they haven't got the fire support when they first come up against those troops. That's the point. And so they have to give a little bit, then hold quite a lot, and then eventually the firepower kicks in. But There's these moments in the kind of early part of the day and all through the morning until the middle of the afternoon where not very many infantrymen are holding an awful lot of Germans with not a lot of support, and that's the key thing.
It's really. I was going to say, it's really. Go on. There is a colossal artillery failure on D-Day on the Canadian front, and I spoke to several people when I started this project 20 years ago who were still alive in Compass Menta about why didn't you guys fire? Well, there was no problem. We were ready to go. So it was hard to actually get to the bottom of it, because the old guys, particularly in the gunners, knew that there had been just a horrendous failure. It's still a pretty slippery subject, but here's an army whose whole doctrine is predicated on massive fire support, as James quite rightly points out. And actually it's 9th Brigade. It's the Canadian equivalent of the Highland Brigade, North Nova Scotia Highlands. There's Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry Highlanders, and the Highland Light Infantry, who get down that road towards Buron and Auty. And they fight on the earliest I can detect fire support for them is 7 p.m. in the evening, 1900 hours. On the 7th, D+1. And the curious thing is that my father's regiment, 13th Field, and 12th Field Regiment, are only about 3,000 meters away across the Mew River in a little village called Bray. And they're in place by 3 o'clock. But there are no fire orders getting through. For whatever reason, there is some speculation. The intelligence sergeant of the North Nova Scotia Highlanders, a guy named Langell, said many years later that the Germans were actually jamming the radio frequencies. And those of you who know German units better than me will know that every German division has a radio counterintelligence unit and a jamming unit. So according to Herman Langell, not Herman, sorry, that's my neighbor at the cottage, Sergeant Langell, they couldn't get through. The problem with getting access, they had a forward officer bombardment from HMS Belfast with a radio link, and they found out later that he was so far forward that they needed to put a repeater somewhere between the area around Caen and the beach in order for that radio link to be effective. There are also problems with too many radios operating on the same frequency on that day. So Belfast may well be firing, but she's not firing in support of the advance of 9th Brigade. But there's a huge amount of German artillery firing. I counted it's probably in the order of 70 or 80 field pieces, actually blasting 9 Brigade as it heads south.
Well, 9th Brigade are kind of almost... They're kind of sort of almost north of Caen, aren't they? Kind of just northwest of Caen. But it's the 7th Infantry Brigade that is sort of heading towards Norrie and round there.
Yeah, 7th Brigade gets a free pass on D+1. There's nobody in front of them. They actually are on their objective by noon. The tanks have actually rumbled. Some tanks have actually moved south of Norrie.
Yeah, and they've got this big kind of. I mean, on the map, if you do look at kind of Project 44, you can see there's this huge like finger. They do get through Norrie, don't they? And then they get pushed back when the 12th SS counterattack, and it all gets a bit.
Well, the original plan doesn't call for them to occupy Norrie. It's one of those things where they get to Bretteville and they look out, and you can do this even today. Yeah. You look out, and Norrie sits out there like a bastion. Yeah. And
well, they get as far as Tubb, who's a
no, the infantry doesn't. The tanks probably do, and I know that there are certainly patrols. I talked to one guy who was in 13th Field, who was surveying for gun positions, who got to Carpiquet,
right,
on D+1. Wow. Right, and it's kind of like, holy shit, there's Germans here. Get out, turn around, take off. Right, so the front is very fluid. But 7 Brigade gets to its fortress position, and they dig in, and they start laying on defensive fire tasks from the 2 regiments and the whole shooting match. And so by the time the 12th SS starts to probe and poke around 7 Brigade, they're pretty well tucked in. They've got good fire support. They got their anti-tank guns up, and they're ready. They're loaded for bear, and it starts that night, the night of the 7th, and runs right through to the end of the day on the 10th. The attacks that take place there, and they are intense attacks. As I said in the book, to me, there's 2 really great stories here. And I had one group of Canadians at one point wanted to make a feature film about Gordon Brown and the defense of the Cardenville factory. It's often called the Cardenville Farm, but on the north side of the railway, it's still there, although it's in the process of being developed, is a little stone building that was a factory. And Gordon Brown, who was the company transport officer on D-Day, finds himself in there with about 45 men who were left over from D Company and an entire new platoon of about 40 guys, 20 guys, 40 guys from who just come ashore on the beach. And they've moved over from La Villeneuve, and they've been told to hold this kind of outpost. And Gordon Brown puts the new platoon in the orchard just north of the factory, and then just basically builds a little fortress in the factory and holds his ground there. And on the night of the 8th and 9th of June, Brown records 20 Panthers right around his little factory. And he doesn't know what to do because you're not supposed to attack at night with tanks without infantry support. And at one point, he crawls out into the orchard where he's got 2 of the battalion 6-pounders deployed. And he crawls out on his hands and knees and finds the sergeant who's in command of this little section of anti-tank guns and says, why aren't you firing at the tanks? And the sergeant says, well, what do you want me to do with the tanks that are here in the orchard with us? And Brown said he had to stop for a minute. And as he listened, he could hear the gentle rumble of the Tiger's diesels or the Panther's diesels. And then he could see them, and he counted them, and there were 6.
My God.
Right around this little space about the size of maybe 3 basketball courts. And stuck right in the middle is this little section of anti-tank guns with about a dozen guys around it. And 16 platoon all dug in slit trenches wondering what the hell they're supposed to do next. And so they Brown concocts a plan with the sergeant that they will attack the Panthers with sticky bombs. And anyway, Brown scampers back into the actual main building at Cardenville, and he gets back in, and then all of a sudden, all hell breaks loose in the orchard. They don't know what happened because everybody in the orchard actually was killed. Many of them crushed when the tanks just drove over the slit trenches and buried them. There were 2 wounded guys who were pulled out of that orchard later, and they couldn't tell them anything. But either somebody got out to have a dump, or the sticky bombs didn't work. But once they discover that there are infantry around, then they start prowling around Gordon Brown's little enclave, and his troops are gradually whittled down to about 30-odd guys, all of them with automatic weapons of some sort, a lot of MG-42s and Schmeisers, anything they could get their hands on. And finally, sometime early in the morning, the tanks drive away. And then the infantry wakes up, and a company strength of about 250, right, or 220 probably, which is the size of the average 12th SS company, comes surging over the rail line from the south, from Cardenville Farm, and surrounds this little outpost of Gordon Brown and his 30-odd Canadians. And Brown's freaking out because the hand grenades are coming over the wall, and the Germans are coming in through the windows, and they're dying. It's like a scene from Fort Apache. And he finally gets through to Colonel Clifford, who's the commander of 13th Field, and Gordon and Brown sends him the coordinates for the fire support, and Clifford says, "That's your spot." And Brown said, "Yeah, I know." So Clifford said, "Tell your guys to get under. We'll have it there in a minute." And according to Brown, it just landed. Most of it on the rail line between the little factory and Cardenville Farm to the south. The next morning, Brown went out and buried 50 German dead. The list of the German dead is in the Saskatchewan archives in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. Wow. Mostly 12th SS, but some Panzer and he buried them right across the road from, and they were since disinterred and taken to Lacombe. And Brown was just gobsmacked. Said, first you attack with tanks in the dark, and then you attack with infantry in daylight with no tanks. And said, what the hell are these guys trying to do? But the defense of Cardenville Farm, if it had been an American incident, Spielberg would be making a movie. It's just that good. It's just astonishing. And the second incident, and then I'll stop talking. You can ask me questions because we haven't talked yet about the complete stopping of the Panzers. Is a fellow named Gordon Henry, who arrives just to the southeast of Bretteville on the morning of the 9th of June with a troop of tanks from the Fort Garry Horse from Winnipeg, and his own troop is from the 1st Canadian Hussars out of London, Ontario. And he's got about 10 or 12 tanks. The information's not quite clear. And about 3 or 4 of them, maybe half a dozen, are Sherman Fireflies. So he arrives just at the top of the railway, southeast of Bretteville, which is now hard to imagine because the 4-lane highway runs through it. Just as a company of Panther tanks are coming out from underneath the bridge at La Villeneuve and going up that gentle slope towards Norrie. And he catches them in flank. And by all accounts, Gordon Henry himself, his gunner, a guy named Chapman, kills 5 Panthers with 5 shots in about 4 minutes. And he was lining up for his 6th when his troop sergeant, Art Boyle, put a round into it. The Germans just scamper away. And when people asked afterwards, why wasn't Gordon Henry, celebrated as some kind of hero? Because this is quite a remarkable accomplishment by any standards. His brigadier said, we're not giving out gongs for people who do their job. Your job is to kill tanks. You kill tanks. Good for you. Keep up the good work. So there's a little Canadian press story that comes out about 2 weeks later about Gordon Henry and his tank, the Comtesse de Feu. But Gordon Henry's accomplishment, and actually the whole accomplishment of that little 2 troops of tanks, it's just not there. And again, if that had been, forgive me, a Brit, or if it had been an American, oh my God, it's the stuff of movies. It's like Fury all over again, right? And Gordon Henry just disappears after the war. I went to the First Desires Museum when I was doing research on this, and I asked about him, and they said, who? What? No, never heard of him. So the Canadians are responsible in some ways for their own obscurity. We just, there's a tendency, you can see it in what we did in Afghanistan. You just go in, you do the job, you go home. It's all over. So when you read about the surge in Kandahar, the Canadians did nothing for 5 or 6 years. The Americans come in, they win the war. The other thing we should talk about just briefly, because I see we're running down, is
that's all right. It's all amazing stuff, Mark.
I don't want to keep going on.
That rump of 1st Canadian Army, remember we left them earlier in the program? Andy McNaughton had been sacked, 3rd Canadian Division's going across the beach, and 2nd Canadian Corps is kind of twiddling its thumbs in the UK. That becomes I would submit, and I've argued in a couple of places, and I'm going to do it again, that becomes the beating heart of Operation Fortitude South. Now, Fortitude South, what becomes later known as Fortitude South 1. Because when George Patton is identified to the Abwehr, finally, as the commanding officer of 1st U.S. Army Group on the 12th of June, everyone says, oh, well, it's George Patton. He's the guy who keeps the Germans fixated on the Pas-de-Calais. And I would argue that's not the case. The Germans are tracking where the Canadians are going. If you look at Roger Hesketh's official history, secret history of deception, the Canadian Army plays a pretty important role. He doesn't focus on it, I think probably because he didn't realize the extent to which 1st Canadian Army had been the go-to army, the public relations army for Operation Overlord. But the Canadians are deeply involved in the radio operations that take place as part of Fortitude South. It's interesting that 1st U.S. Army Group consists of 2 armies. It consists of 3rd U.S. Army, which is not yet formed. It's formed. It's notional. The divisions are still assembling, mostly in the Midlands and in the West. 1st Canadian Army is assembled in Kent. They're the guys who are dragging their sleeve in the English Channel and doing the movements. And it's interesting that on the 7th and 8th of June, 2nd Canadian Division is undertaking amphibious training operations in the Medway River. And the Canadians have been tasked to work on a potential landing in the Scheldt estuary since September of 1943, and I haven't found that anywhere in the Fortitude literature. It's in the Canadian narratives, but it's not in the Fortitude literature. If you read Horst Boog's book, The German Official History, on 6th of June, they're worried about a landing in 2 places. One is the Pas-de-Calais, and the other, he says, is the Scheldt. So if you look at the planning for 1st U.S. Army Group, the army that's going to do the assault is 1st Canadian Army. That's the assaulting army. There are 2 corps in 1st Canadian Army, 2nd Canadian Corps, and forgive me, I think it's the 8th U.S. Corps, but don't quote me on that. It's 1st Canadian Corps that's the designated assault force for 1st U.S. Army Group. They're the people who are supposed to go ashore. The Germans think there are 13 divisions in 1st Canadian Army. And I have to just read you, I have one smoking gun, which I'm going to burden you with. You may know if you've tracked this, on the night of the 9th of June, the Germans make a critical decision to divert the panzer divisions that are supposed to be going west of Caen into the zone either side of the Meuse River Valley. 1st SS Panzer Division, which is garrisoned around Amiens, and 116th Panzer Division, which is at Mantes, west of Paris. Both of them are, in theory, en route to Normandy until the evening of the 9th of June, when a message comes from Garbo that it looks like a landing in Calais is imminent. It's the day after, by the way, 2nd Canadian Division has just finished its training exercise in the Medway River. And they've taken their vehicles down to Southampton and along the coast, and they've begun to waterproof them and get ready to go. This is the article that appears in the Chicago Tribune on the morning of the 10th of June, 1944. It's datelined London, June 9th, 1944. German broadcasts predicted today that the Allies would soon invade Belgium between Dunkirk and Ostend, the radio said. And then it quotes, divisions ready in northeast England have not yet been committed. It can be assumed that a big part of these forces will be thrown into some invasion attempt, which should start within the next few days. Combined action is being expected somewhere between Dunkirk and Ostend. For this, special Canadian troops are in readiness. Special Canadian troops are in readiness.
Wow.
So that rump of 1st Canadian Army diverts the Panzer forces, at least for about 10 days, away from Normandy. 1st SS, and then Patton takes over on the 12th, and it becomes an American story.
Right.
And somehow that story of Fortitude South 2 gets morphed into Patton in April, May, and June, leading Fortitude South 1. And it just ain't so. If you read Michael Howard's paragraph on it in Volume 5 of the British Official History of Intelligence, there's a whole paragraph in there about how Patton was crucial to this. There's no references, no citations, no documentation. There is none. So, the Canadian moment in some ways is like a Roman candle. We go ashore. And by the way, on the 8th of June, 12th SS in front of the Canadians. Panzer Lehr is deployed in front of the Canadians. A fair slice of 21st Panzer is deployed in front of the Canadians. And where does Rommel go when he goes to Normandy for the first time? Do you know? Guess.
Here.
He's within rifle shot of the Royal Winnipeg Rifles. He's either at Le Mesnil-Patrie or he's at Che, somewhere. But he's right in front of the Canadians. Took me a while to find that because he didn't go to the British or American front, so nobody's interested. Anyway, so Schweppenberg, after the war, freaks out. He says, we had a chance on the 8th of June. We had most of 3 Panzer divisions lined up on the Meuse, and we panicked, and we just didn't do it. And, we had our chance, and the chance was gone. So the Canadians have this little moment where they kind of Roman candle in the Normandy campaign. And everybody's busy describing everybody else's action. And it's a busy place, as James knows only too well. You try to write this up, and man, there's actions across 100 miles of front. And by the time it's all over, the Canadians are down about 3,500 guys. The Germans have dispersed elsewhere. Panzer Lehr's gone off to Tilly to try to battle the British. And 1st SS is kind of held in limbo, and it takes a while for them to start bringing those Panzer forces in. And by the way, when they do eventually bring them in, they bring them into that area, right?
Yeah, of course they do.
West of
that's where they all go. Yeah, and there's those great German maps of Normandy where you can see it, and they list all the Panzer divisions at the front on the Normandy front. You see the changes stuff. The concentration around that area is just extraordinary, really.
Well, it's a 33-mile front, apparently. And by the time of Epsom, there are 8 German Panzer divisions along 33 miles of front. Yeah. And the comparable American front running to the west, by the time, taking Cherbourg out of it, is 55 miles. And there are elements of one, because 2nd Panzer and 2nd SS Panzer kind of switch forces back and forth across that Comau Gap. So it's, as my father said, sorry, I'm trying not to channel my father into this. He said, we were so incompetent that we only managed to hold 80% of the German tanks on our front for 2 months.
Yeah, it's.
So you can see where I inherited the kind of view of this.
Absolutely.
I mean, I think it is amazing. I mean, you think about the point about, I suppose the 716 is not the best combat unit. They're kind of undermanned and under-equipped and all that kind of stuff. 21st Panzer is cobbled together and is already in situ, but the 12th SS when it comes is really full of troops, highly motivated troops, pretty experienced commanders, all those kind of things. It's got all the weaponry, and it's coming in and they're being funneled straight in. And what they're coming up against is they're just sort of pretty much stopped dead, and that is really impressive. And for me, it tells you a number of things. It tells you, it suggests one option is that the 12 SS aren't quite as good as they're cracked up to be. It tells you that, alternatively, the Canadians are much better than they've been narratively cracked up to be. And I would say that's absolutely the case. I mean, I don't think the the 12th SS have been cracked up to be better than they are. I think they are a pretty good unit when they first arrive in Normandy because of those factors, because they're motivated, because they're well equipped, because they're for the most part decently led. The Canadians absolutely cut it. I mean, they do an incredible job of holding it. And then, as you rightly point out, Mark, when you then add in the 716 and large elements of 21st Panzer as well, it's a bloody good effort. It really is incredible what they do. Because they're new to Normandy at this point. We're talking D+1, 2, 3. And they haven't got all their ducks in a row at this point. They haven't got all that, they're getting their firepower together. But this is a process as they're kind of coming off the landing craft and off the ships and all the rest of it. They're not all quite kind of in sync. And it is really those lead elements of infantry and a handful of tanks that are doing the hard yards in this instance, particularly on D+1 and 2. And, that is very impressive, and it's an undersold story.
But it's when they're at their most...
It's when the Germans are strongest and they're the most vulnerable, and they absolutely deliver in spades.
Well, and don't forget that the assault strength of Canadian companies, as with British companies, is 119. They're not at full-strength companies. They're much reduced, and the 12th SS companies are about 220 men, and when they distribute the pioneer battalions among them, some of them are actually 240 men. The Canadians describe waves of Germans coming across, and people say, "Oh, that's hyperbole. It's just a bunch of." No, there were waves of 12th SS coming at them. All this. My final point, and I'm trying to resolve this as a Canadian because I don't know how I'm going to do it. These are all volunteers. They're very highly trained, and they're exceptionally well motivated. What would Normandy look like if 5 Canadian divisions and 2 Canadian armored brigades were ashore in D+14? Would they have retreated from Villers-Bocage? You can't argue that Tommy's no soldier. If you study Tilly-sur-Seulles, oh my God. The Brit, and you look at what goes on in Epsom. But the Canadians don't have the problem of that 7th Armored did with people who thought that they had fought their war already, and they should be home, or with 51st Highland Division who said, we've done this long enough. It's somebody else's turn. All 5 of those Canadian divisions just couldn't wait to fight the Germans. And I haven't got it sorted out yet, but what would Normandy look like with 2 Canadian Corps and 1st Canadian Army ashore and ready to fight by D+14? I don't know that it would have changed much, but I haven't sorted that out yet. And I'm not going to belabor the point, but,
Well, what you can talk about very confidently, though, is what they actually did do with the resources they got, and that is indisputably incredibly impressive.
Yeah. Well, Michael Reynolds said the defense of Puteaux, Norrie, Bretteville was one of the finest small unit actions of the Second World War. Full stop.
Well, there you go.
I think he's right. He's right.
I would agree with that as well.
Well,
and I've said it many times, but it's
their training was superb. Their training was superb. Their motivation was outstanding. Their dedication to the cause, and the Canadians carp afterwards about failures. We didn't get to Berlin. Anyway, Canadians are kind of like Brits. We tend to focus on more on our failings perhaps than our successes. We're our own worst enemies.
But Mark, why are they well motivated for a European war? Why? What's the because you can understand why it's a war of national survival for Britain. Because after all, the further you get from the United Kingdom, the harder it is to mobilise British soldiers to give a toss for why they're fighting. The desert, Iraq, Burma. The further away you get, the more slippery the question of what you're doing this for gets. Why are Canadians motivated to fight the Germans in? Is it round 2? Is it Vimy? Is it?
Yeah, I think there's 2 things. One is the legacy of the Canadian Corps.
Yeah.
Our fathers and our uncles kicked some serious ass in 1918, and we're going to do the same thing. Yeah. And so some of and I haven't got to those chapters yet, but some of the disappointment from Totalize and Tractable derives from the fact that they're not doing to the Germans in 1944 what the Canadian Corps did between the 8th of August and the 11th of November in 1918. So there's some gnashing of teeth over that. The second thing is, don't forget, Canada is actually a country that's globally engaged in the way that Americans are not.
Yeah.
We're part of the British Empire, part of the British Commonwealth. Yeah. We identify with British interests. We're more attuned to what's going on in Europe. And there's a strong sense in Canada that the Nazis are a bad bunch of bastards, and you have to stop them. If we'd done what we should have done in 1918, which has gone all the way to Berlin, we wouldn't have this problem. So there's a very strong motivation to fix what was left unfixed that I don't find in any discussion in the American combat motivation literature. In fact, Americans are complaining through June that the Americans haven't figured out what they're fighting for, except that if they win, they get to go home. Canadians have come to defeat Nazism. They've come to do it in Italy, and they've come to do it in Normandy. And it's a strange phenomenon. But if you had asked people like my father, hey, join the army and why don't you garrison Iceland? They all would have defected. They didn't join the army to garrison. I mean, the Canadian Army almost went stir crazy in Britain. There's a major crime spree in late 43 because there's nothing to do. Where are the friggin' Germans, right? So the Canadian Army came to fight, and they could hardly wait to get into combat. Now, you could argue maybe by week 2, some of them are thinking, maybe this wasn't. Yeah, but the Army was all volunteer. The leadership at the battalion, company, junior leadership level was really quite good. There's been quite a bit of new literature on why is the Canadian Army as good as it is, it all argues that the training and motivation of senior NCOs and junior battalion and unit level officers is just really good. You take a guy like my father, who's a Depression-era kid with grade 9 education, and he was overwhelmingly impressed with his officers. There's none of this, Hollywood tends to have officers being fragged, and, that's the 6-week wonder or whatever it is, 6-month wonder. My father was filled with nothing but admiration for the young foos who went forward and died in large numbers. And by Colonel Clifford, who, while they were all hiding in a basement somewhere trying to avoid the Nebelwerfers, was out trying to get a bearing on the German mortar so he could engage them with counter battery fire. So the whole army was like that. My uncle fought, by the way, in Italy. He was in a rifle company for 16 or 18 months. He survived the war in a rifle company. And I asked him once, what did you think of the Canadian Army? And he said, we had a good little army. People were motivated, they were well trained, and we chased those bastards up the boot of Italy, trying to get them, and we fought well. And I don't know where that inner Führung came from, but the Canadians had it, and they were glad when it was over. But boy, they just thought the Nazis had to be stopped.
Well, thank God they did.
Thanks so much for talking to us about this. Obviously, we look out for the next subject James is going to write about, and you'll have covered it.
I don't think so.
Yeah, you're looking at my cookie.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. Exactly. This has been great.
And stopping the Panzers. While we were talking at a glance, is available. In Kindle and all other formats. So grab that, everybody, if you can, because it's. The problem is as you say, there are so many plates spinning in Normandy that you end up. An author has to pick an emphasis, don't they? And especially if you're writing an entire campaign history, things are going to slip through the cracks. But this book addresses that entirely.
And it is an amazing, and the other thing is that no one goes to see the Mew, no one goes to Norrie, no one goes to Shoe and all these places. But I tell you what, it's really, really worth it. It's absolutely fascinating. It really is fascinating.
Well, let me tell you a good news story about that. Shortly after the book came out, I got a completely unsolicited email from a chap at the West Point Military Academy, and he said, I just wanted to let you know that we have added the advance of the Canadians on D+1 and D+3, 4 as part of our battlefield study tour. We've never done the British and Canadian zone before, but we have to go study this battle. I don't know if they're still doing it, but people have begun to drift in. The Americans, as a tradition, don't go to the Anglo-Canadian front. I remember Brooks Kleber, who wrote one of the volumes, and was actually captured in Normandy on the 9th of June as a young subaltern, told me when I gave a paper at a conference once, and he chaired the session. He says, we, as Americans, we really should start going to the British zone. It's like, but don't you? When you study Normandy? Apparently not. Apparently they just go to, they stay in Bayeux, and because that's a good place to stay, and then they just drive the American zone.
Yeah. Well, when I did my little three-parter on Normandy a couple of years back, we went to Oti and Buron and told that story of the Canadians on D+1, and there it is.
Excellent, thank you.
And like I say, whatever Jim's writing about next, he can do his heavy echo. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mark. It's always a pleasure. We'll see you again soon.
Thanks
everybody, for listening. James and I will be back with more War Georgia in your ears soon.
Cheers.
Cheers.